secondary dominants let us use chords that are from outside of the key. But then the question is, what sort of scale would you play over that? Or what sort of melody would you have to write over a secondary dominant? Do you always just use the arpeggio and that's it? No. Of course, we're going to talk about the scales for dominant chords. I'm going to give you a scale for each combination of added notes. Whether they're alterations or not, whether they're extensions or not, just any combination of added notes, I will give you a scale for. So let's get started with the simplest one, Mixolydian. So Mixolydian is just the major scale with a minor 7th, and the dominant chord is just a major chord with a minor 7th. It's a very simple combination of scale and chord, and it's just a church mode. Which brings us to the next that's kind of church mode-like, and it's Little Mixolydian or Lydian dominant. And this is Lydian, which is major with an augmented 4th, and Mixolydian, which is major with a minor 7th, combined to make major with an augmented 4th and a minor 7th. And this scale is actually the 4th mode of melodic minor. So if you already know your melodic minor patterns, you'll notice that your fingers are already accustomed to the fingerings of the scale. And next up, the last scale that is very much like a church mode, and this is Phrygian dominant. Now, think about this for a second. If we take a minor key and we take the 5th chord in a minor key, generally that's a minor chord, and this disturbs our dominant tonic relationship. So generally, if we're playing in a minor key, the 5th chord is turned into a dominant chord. And over this dominant chord, now I'm playing A minor and E7. If we would play E harmonic minor, this is the reason we came up with harmonic minor for this chord. If we play A harmonic minor, going from E to E, we're actually playing Phrygian dominant. It's just a mode of harmonic minor. Now there are two scales that I call symmetrical scales, although there are different types of symmetry, but these are at least symmetrical. And one of them is the whole tone scale, or anhemitonic hexatonic. Nobody wants to know that name, just the whole tone scale. Called that way because it consists of nothing but whole tones, and it sounds like this. Now, one thing you can notice about this scale is that every note sounds as resolved or as unresolved as every other note, at least when you play it in isolation, without the context of a bass note or a chord. Just take a listen. Equally as fine as nothing going on. Let's try a different one. They're all equally fine. Every note is as tonic as every other note because there are no semitones. And semitones would create leading tones that lead us to a certain tone, obviously. And without any leading tones, so without any semitones, every note is as unresolved as every other note. So this is a very unresolved scale, and it's also called the dream scale or a scale of mystery, and it's often used, in film music to create something very dreamlike, although you can also hear it in the intro of You Are the Sunshine of My Life by Stevie Wonder, which has an intro somewhat like, although it's played on piano and I'm not sure which key, but that's the essence of it. A major 3rd moved up in whole tones, just continuously moved up in a certain rhythm. This scale is a bit harder to memorize because we don't have any other church modes to lean on to help us guide our understanding of what's in the scale and what isn't in the scale. So what you need to know is 1, 2, 3, that's just whole tones. And if you go down from the octave, you reach the minor 7th. So the only question here is what's in between the minor 7th and the major 3rd. And if you go down a whole tone and up a whole tone, down from the minor 7th or from the major 3rd, you end on the minor 6th, minor 13, and on the augmented 4th or the flat 5, the tritone. So those are the two to really remember in this scale, because the other ones are pretty logical and not all that difficult to remember. There's another symmetrical scale. Now this scale is called the octatonic scale, and it has two versions. Now, an octatonic scale has 8 different notes, and the way we reach that 8th note before we reach the octave is by having extra semitones. Because how else are we going to bridge the gap all the way to the octave with an extra note in between? Well, we need more semitones. So this scale follows a pattern of whole tone, half tone, or semitone, whole tone, semitone, and that just goes on forever. Now, it has 2 versions, one starting on the whole tone and one starting on the semitone. We'll take a look at the one starting on the whole tones later on when we talk about diminished chords. So for now we're going to talk about the one starting with the half tone. And this is, it starts out really weird, so bear with me because it becomes more logical later on. So we start out with a flat 2. And then an augmented 2 because we also have a major third. And if we have a minor third and a major third in a chord or in a scale, the major third is leading. This is just what the ears fill in when they hear those notes. The major third will end up sounding like the major third, causing the minor third to end up sounding like an added note. So we have flat 2, sharp 2 or augmented second, major third. We went up a semitone, so now we go up a whole tone to the augmented fourth, and then 5, 6, minor 7, 1. So what's normal about this scale is actually everything from the augmented fourth up until the octave. That doesn't look all that weird, and the major third isn't all that weird. What's weird is this minor second and augmented second. That's what you need to remember about the octatonic scale. Another thing to remember here is that it has all the alterations except for the 13th. So if you see a chord that has a major 13th, but it has a flat 9 or a major 13 and an augmented 9th, let's say, you know, chords like that, when they have a major 13th and alterations, use octatonic. You'll always get away with it. Now we're going to end up with 7 scales in total. We have Mixolydian, Lydian dominant, Phrygian dominant, and the 2 symmetrical scales, the whole tone and the octatonic scale. Just 2 more scales, and one of them we've already talked about in the previous lesson. It's the melodic major scale, sometimes called Mixolydian flat 6. We already know this one. It starts out like a major scale and ends like a minor scale. And it sounds very natural when you use it on a chord with a flat 13, but it's certainly not the only sound you can use there, because we have one more scale to talk about, and this is the altered scale. So conceptualize this scale like this. Every dominant chord needs, well, a root or a tonic, it needs a major third and a minor 7th. Everything else can be missed, just the root, the major third and the minor 7th. And then all the other notes in this scale are all the alterations, which is why it's called the altered scale. Now there's a second name for this, and I'll probably draw this out on the screen or something, but if you take Locrian, you have a 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, 1, or the 8. So everything has the flat sign except the 4. So what do you get if you also lower the 4th? You get Super Locrian, which is a really original name, but in essence it's actually the altered scale. The difference is how you think about certain notes and the kind of tension they might create, but it's the same set of keys on the piano, it's the same frets on the guitar, it's the same scale. The reason I don't call it a diminished fourth is for the same reason as we did in the octatonic scale. If you have a minor third and a major third, the major third is leading. This is what's actually going to sound like a major third. So the minor third ends up sounding like an augmented second. And this is actually everything you need to know to play scales over secondary dominants with weird notes added to them. You now have a combination for each chord there is, for each secondary dominant there is. So let's give it a try. Say we're in the key of C, we want to move to the 3 chord. That's E minor 7, and we take a secondary dominant that leads us there. That's B7. And now we're going to add some weird notes to B7, like say flat 13 and flat 9. Which scale could be played over this? I'm going to give you a second, and then we're going to get to the answer. Phrygian dominant would be one answer. Now Phrygian is a minor scale, so that has a flat 6 or a flat 13 or a minor 13. So it's a minor scale with a minor second, so that's the flat 9. And then Phrygian dominant is the version of Phrygian that has a major third instead of a minor third, so it can be played over a dominant chord. So Phrygian dominant would work here. However, it's also a dominant chord where all the added notes are alterations, so the altered scale would work just as well. Octatonic wouldn't, because octatonic has a major 13 instead of a minor 13. Okay, but what's more important here is that you get around to playing all these scales and just vamp on one single chord, one single secondary dominant, and just run up and down in a certain scale to get used to what it sounds like and how you can create melodies with it. And then, when you're used to these scales, create a vamp that has like... So what we're taking here is just two chords from the key of C, C major and D minor, and we're taking a secondary dominant to D minor, and we're taking a dominant to C major. Now generally this is just the 5 chord, the regular dominant, but you could choose to play a different scale over it than what you might expect. The major scale is just there to glue the harmony together and to guide our ears towards what sounds resolved and what sounds like tension. But you can change up the melody any way you like. Of course, this is a bit free to play in this way, but it helps you get accustomed to using certain scales. So I hope you have fun playing around with that. I hope you use it in your improvisations and in your compositions. And as always, create something you enjoy. Not because it's a popular thing to say, but because it's more useful. It's not supposed to be a homework assignment that you just get through and now you've done that thing. No, you're supposed to make these sounds your own. So it needs to go from understanding, which we've done right now, to hearing, which is what you can train also by playing it, but also by figuring out songs by ear, to feeling, which is where you can land, to feeling, which is where you can end up if you apply these sounds in a way that you prefer, that you would rather play like Lydian dominant than a different scale, because that's a sound that feels right to you. That's how those decisions are informed, what feels right. So to move from thinking to hearing to feeling, you need to make something you enjoy. I hope you learned something this video, and I hope I helped you progress. These are all the dominant scales, and next week we're going to get to a way to substitute secondary dominance for a different chord. But we'll get to that next time. Ciao!